I added another line to this title, another phrase, overcome their own problems, because it is not simply by escaping the difficulties that the advanced countries are making and escaping some of their problems that the emerging economies will continue to grow. So I want to go through in 3 points here. The first thing is we had this great recession and recovery has really highlighted a tremendous change in the world. It was something we knew was going to go on, but we thought it would go on over a longer time period. The poor performance of the advanced economies, the great failure of the capital market on which countries like the United States put incredible weight in directing the economy, has really placed us in a terrible situation. I use the word squeaky wheels. We don't know whether the European wheel is going to squeak off and put us into another depression. We don't know whether the American recovery, which is another squeaky wheel, is going to sort of fall off, et cetera. And so the model that people had in their heads of we want to be like the developing economies does not look so good. And I said here they could be facing decades of slow growth and stagnation. If some of the policies that Amartya was denounced or spoke gently against, but he could have been sharper in denouncing them, that are basically going to be sacrificing growth, education, and health, God knows what, to pay back the bondholders. And to pay back the bondholders, many of whom turn out to be the banks who caused the problem, clearly could lead to a long period of poor performance for the advanced countries. I say the emerging economies have other things to worry about as well, and I'll talk a little bit about them. I think the biggest problem that they have is to bring the informal sector workers into the economy. They're not going to disappear, and they're not going to become formal sector workers in anybody's lifetime here. And so there's an interesting question, how do you bring them into the system? So there's avoid the problems of the advanced countries and insulate oneself a bit, and then solve one's own problems. Let me say a word or two about the squeaky wheels of the advanced countries. It is remarkable to a labor economist. And labor economists, Amartya said, well, we're used to being a little rougher and tougher than financial economists or macroeconomists. But it stunned me the extent to which the United States deregulated our financial sector, and I use the word belief. There was no evidence that a deregulated financial sector was going to perform well. There were models, belief in the efficient market, but that is different than scientific evidence. We made a set of decisions without evidence, and that's a terrible warning to people. It is also true that our bailout of Wall Street was not only not based on evidence. Here I have close friends in the Bush administration, and they keep saying, we had no information about these derivatives. We didn't know what was out there. So a government that does not keep good statistics and monitoring, and that's of the finance sector as well as of the other sectors of the economy, just will be making decisions that we don't know if they're right or wrong. And they didn't know if they were right or wrong. They believed that smaller banks or the government couldn't have stepped in and have provided the liquidity except through the banks that were too big to fail, and that now are fewer of those, and they're still too big to fail. And they ultimately, that's a part of the advanced economies that we have not solved. And whatever the Americans did to this, the Europeans seem to have done even less. So there's great weaknesses here. This is just a little chart from the ILO that shows you employment changes period. It's from the same period a year ago to the period. And what it shows you is that the advanced countries had the bigger decline in jobs, and the developing countries not only had smaller declines, they've recovered better up until this point. And the data goes through this summer. So in all cases, the advanced countries lie below the developing countries. I don't know how surprised other people were. I was extremely surprised, particularly when China, when they had the 20 million people working in the South were sent home when the export market fell. I would not have believed that a year later the Chinese economy would be humming and their wage increases of 16 to 20% for those same people, the migrant labor. Extraordinary. And so we've learned a lesson about the strengths and weaknesses of the advanced countries and the emerging economies. And of course, India has also done well, but is now in a shaky position. This is in manufacturing. It's the same story. The manufacturing jobs are just not going to come back in the advanced countries, and they will be growing elsewhere. We have, and people have already discussed, the problem of the EU sovereign debt crisis. It is not out of the question what the odds would be. You could look in maybe Ladbrokes or some of the, in the US, we have the Iowa prediction market. I haven't looked at what the bets are on this, that we will see a chaotic collapse of the euro with countries re-bringing in their own currency and a real disaster. Odds, I don't know, 30% maybe, 20%, maybe higher. Britain, there's no doubt that the government has chosen a path of double-dip recession. And when they will change their mind, one does not know. But that's what they've chosen. In the US, we have, for the first time since the 1960s, have begun to see protests in the street. These are the occupiers who have now, they've been in Wall Street, they've been pushed out of Wall Street, they've been in Washington, they're pushed out, but they're still around, and they represent a large fraction of American people who see the average person paying for the disasters that the banks did while the banks are back. We have political division and stalemate, and we don't look very capable as a democracy at this point of addressing our problems. And then, this reiterates a point Amartya made, governments cut back, and how much can you be cutting back before you actually bring extraordinary harm to your long-term economic position? So then piece of it, I suppose, advice, but everyone doesn't know quite exactly how to fill it out. The emerging economies need some disaster plans. And I hope the Indian Ministry of Finance and elsewhere, Planning Commission, have some scenarios written out if the advanced countries really do go into a terrible second depression. Probably won't be as bad as the first depression, but we could see throughout the advanced countries something like the stagnation of Japan, and probably worse, because Japan, even during their stagnant period, were growing modestly, and we're not doing all that bad. So you have to think about this as the disease or problem one may have to insulate oneself from. So I said, well, in India here is an advantage over some of the other countries because of the strong domestic demand. I think the Minister of Finance pointed out earlier this morning. And then you have to think, I think, more of the South-South trade with other developing countries, because if the advanced countries are going to be in a stagnant period for a long period, you cannot expect to be selling goods there. Multinationals are very interesting because they have no national loyalty. And if your economy is doing well, they will move. The American multinationals only concerned with bottom line, and they're happy to move a lot of their operations to India and China. IBM is very proud of this and has done very good things. The head of IBM said there will never be another job in America. meaning they're not going to be expanding employment at all. And in a situation in which we may have stagnation in the advanced countries, you'll see more of that. And then there's a weakness that I think India has, which China does not have, which is having currency reserves. Korea, having been burnt by the Asian flu in the crisis, built up huge reserves. They were the only advanced country, or almost, they're on the tip of the advanced of the OECD. They came back extremely well. They have basically no higher unemployment than when they were in. They were back on a growth path. And what happened was by having the currency reserves, they were able to do things that other countries could not in their stimulus. And then somewhere we have to change the global financial system, because it is not just a squeaky wheel. It is a broken wheel that has broken, and it'll break again, and it will cause more and more problems to us. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the weaknesses of the advanced economies, and then get to the situation in the emerging economies. What was this great problem that made the finance collapse? We said, well, we deregulated, but we also financialized everything. There were companies in the United States that were making all of their money from financial transactions instead of goods and services they were producing. There was a huge payoff from leveraging your bets, cleaning up on your fees, and I use the word chicanery here. That's I believe it's a French word, but it means you're basically not being honest with your clients, but maybe you didn't quite commit a crime because your lawyer told you that you could not do this. That was throughout this system. It still is throughout this system, in our banking system, and a terrible situation. I think the one part of globalization that has not succeeded, and here I put down my friend Jagdish Bhagwati, who was always warning, don't go for international mobility of capital. And it is a very dangerous kind of a thing, and there's no evidence that it helped countries very much at all. International mobility of the large multinationals, yes. International mobility of ideas, yes. International mobility of trade, yeah, international trade, yes. International mobility of those things, but the capital just can be extremely dangerous. So the whole world banking system collapses, not just the ones in the advanced West. But then I said at the bottom here, it's extremely hard to regulate. What financiers do, financial people, you sit around and you put some law on them, and they're sitting in their offices and saying, how do we get around it? How do we re-leverage up and make it just as risky as before, because we make large amounts of money from risk? It is a very difficult thing, and I just put some question marks here of ways. How do you control this? The advanced countries, particularly the US, have high and rising inequality. Huge inequalities give bad incentives. No inequality gives no incentives. You want to have some incentives, you don't want to have bad incentives. And it leads to, I said here, crony capitalism. That was a word that once the Americans certainly attached to developing emerging economies. You'd think of Philippines and Indonesia in particular. And now it's the conservative Republicans running for president use it regularly to describe the American system. And it's because once you have massive inequalities, the rich people use their monies to preserve their wealth and to basically pollute the political system. So that's to me is a giant problem. What has happened in the advanced countries is the institutions that were meant to defend normal people have grown weaker. Labor institutions, as my son pointed out, I'm a specialist in labor, are meant to balance off the powers of capital and make sure workers get some part of the pie. But they cause some inefficiencies in doing this. And I know the Indian unions are not renowned for being an efficient institution, et cetera. But unless one has these kind of institutions of some form, you do not have a balance in the economic system. Now I want to talk about the last and most disturbing thing I think that has happened in the advanced countries. This is the loss of a positive vision. When there were the communists out there and the planned economies, we in the West had a vision of democracy and free markets. Now that basically free markets has won, the democracy, well, China will take a long time to get to democracy, but it's certainly much more democratic than it was years ago. And India, as Amartya pointed out, has done well. So we're still left with great challenges, but right now there is no vision, because once the economies have turned sour in the advanced countries, there's a sense, I assume it would occur in all countries, you turn inward, you engage in internal fights, and you don't look forward to the future. And our economies have not been prepared to deal with the emergence of China, India, Brazil, and the other countries. Happened faster than we expected, and we were told at one point that, don't worry, you're going to be the educated people, and the other guys are going to make your shoes, and they'll make your clothing, and et cetera. And of course, I'll give figures in a minute. About 80% of the university students in the world are in emerging economies, not in the advanced countries. The notion, or university students, the notion that somehow or other education is going to make the Western countries superior is just no longer true. And we have some dangers of this anti-immigrant sentiment that we first saw in Europe and we now see in the US. And anti-immigrant sentiment can turn to anti-trade sentiment, and who knows in what ways it will go. And I just say this, it's such a sad thing, because we have more scientists and engineers all around the world. We have more computer power. IBM gave us the machine that could beat people on the Jeopardy game, as well as beat Sakharov, the greatest chess